What if the fear you've been carrying was never real in the first place? What if it was never a wall in front of you, but something quietly planted inside you through words you heard, thoughts you repeated, and moments you never questioned? Because here's the truth, most people never stop long enough to realize. Fear doesn't break into your life loudly. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't attack you. It enters silently, almost respectfully, like a thought that feels reasonable, a concern that feels logical, a warning that feels wise. And before you even notice it, it starts shaping your decisions. It starts deciding what you avoid, what you delay, what you never even try. Not because you are incapable, but because something inside your mind learned to hesitate before it ever learned to move. But here's where it gets even deeper. That same fear doesn't just come from the world around you, it grows inside your own silence, in your overthinking, in your indecision, in those moments when you replay possibilities instead of taking action, and slowly, without realizing it, your mind begins to treat imagination like reality and worry like truth. So the real question is not whether fear exists. The real question is, how did it enter your mind so quietly that you started believing it was you? In this message, we're going deep into something most people never understand in their lifetime. The hidden way fear enters the mind, how it grows in silence, and why it becomes so powerful without ever being physically real. And more importantly, how it can be broken the moment you learn where it truly comes from, because once you see it clearly, you can never be controlled by it the same way again. Stay with this till the end, because what you are about to understand may not just change how you think. It may change how you live, decide, and move from this moment forward. Fear is not born as a physical entity that storms into the mind with visible force. It is a subtle process of suggestion that enters quietly through repeated thoughts, impressions, and influences that are often accepted without examination. It begins when an idea, usually planted by another person, a circumstance, or even a passing remark, finds a small opening in the mind. That idea, if not challenged immediately, begins to grow through repetition. The human mind is highly responsive to what it is exposed to repeatedly, and fear takes advantage of this natural tendency. It does not need permission, it only needs attention. Once attention is given, even briefly, it starts shaping internal dialogue. A single suggestion like doubt about success, safety, or ability can expand when it is replayed internally, especially during moments of silence or inactivity. The mind, when not directed by purpose, becomes fertile ground for such suggestions to multiply. Fear then disguises itself as logic, caution, or reason, making it harder to recognize its presence. It often enters through the voices of others, warnings from friends, concerns from family, or negative assumptions from society. And if these are absorbed without filtering, they slowly become part of one's belief system. The most dangerous aspect of this process is its subtlety. It does not announce itself as fear, but as being realistic. Over time, these repeated suggestions form mental patterns that influence decisions, behavior, and emotional responses. Even without any real external threat, the mind begins to anticipate problems that do not exist, simply because it has been conditioned to expect them. This is how fear grows silently, not through force or confrontation, but through acceptance and repetition. The subconscious mind plays a critical role in this process, recording every repeated thought as truth, regardless of its accuracy. Once recorded, these impressions begin to influence reactions automatically, often without conscious awareness. What makes this even more powerful is that most individuals do not realize they are allowing suggestions to enter unchecked, mistaking them for their own independent thinking. In reality, much of what is labeled as fear is inherited thought, absorbed from environments, conversations, and media, slowly shaping perception and behavior in ways that feel natural but are actually programmed through repetition and suggestion. These programmed patterns operate like invisible instructions, shaping reactions in ordinary situations such as decision-making, risk assessment, and even self-image, without the individual recognizing the original source of the thought. The mind continues to reinforce these patterns each time similar suggestions are encountered, strengthening the illusion that they are personal truths rather than implanted impressions that were accepted over time through repetition and unnoticed acceptance within the silent operations of thought process itself. The subconscious mind operates like a deep recording system that does not argue, judge, or filter information in the way the conscious mind does. It simply absorbs what is repeatedly fed into it and begins to treat those repeated inputs as accepted truth regardless of whether they are accurate or beneficial. And this is where the formation of fear becomes deeply rooted in human behavior. Because when a person repeatedly thinks about worry, failure, danger, or uncertainty, even casually, those thoughts begin to settle below the surface of awareness and slowly integrate into the subconscious framework. And once integrated, they no longer feel like external ideas, but begin to appear as natural instincts or automatic assumptions about life. And this process is not immediate, but gradual, built through repetition, emotional intensity, and attention, meaning the more frequently a thought is entertained, the stronger its imprint becomes, especially when it is accompanied by emotions such as anxiety or doubt. Because emotion acts like a signal that tells the subconscious, this information is important and should be stored more deeply, and over time these stored impressions begin to influence behavior without conscious permission, shaping decisions, reactions, and expectations in ways that feel spontaneous but are actually conditioned responses. And what makes this even more powerful is that the subconscious does not distinguish between real experiences and vividly imagined ones. So when a person constantly visualizes negative outcomes or repeatedly hears discouraging narratives, the mind processes them with the same seriousness as actual events, reinforcing the belief that these outcomes are likely or inevitable. And this creates a feedback loop where thought influences feeling. Feeling reinforces thought, and repetition strengthens belief, gradually turning temporary worries into fixed mental patterns, and these patterns then operate automatically in the background, influencing how opportunities are perceived, how risks are evaluated, and how challenges are interpreted, often causing hesitation or avoidance without the individual fully realizing the origin of that resistance. And because the subconscious is always active, even during rest or distraction, it continues to absorb the dominant mental environment a person maintains throughout the day, which means that exposure to negative conversation, pessimistic thinking, or repeated self-doubt continuously programs the inner mind, slowly replacing neutral or positive expectations with conditioned fear-based responses that feel rational, even when they are not necessarily based on present reality or actual evidence of danger or failure. Indecision creates a silent vacuum in the human mind, and nature of the mind is such that it does not tolerate emptiness for long. So when a person fails to decide, delays action, or remains mentally suspended between choices, that empty space is quickly occupied by uncertainty, doubt, and eventually fear. And this process does not require any external threat, because the absence of decision itself becomes the condition that allows fear to grow internally as the mind begins to generate scenarios to fill the gap that clarity should have occupied. And in doing so, it leans toward negative possibilities more often than positive ones, because the primitive structure of thinking is designed to anticipate danger when direction is unclear. And this is why prolonged hesitation often feels heavier than making a wrong decision, because indecision keeps the mind active without resolution, forcing it to cycle through imagined outcomes repeatedly, each time strengthening emotional discomfort. And over time, this repetition creates mental fatigue that is often misinterpreted as lack of ability or lack of opportunity, when in reality it is simply the consequence of not choosing a direction. And as this continues, fear begins to attach itself to every option available, making even simple choices appear risky or overwhelming. And what once was a neutral situation becomes emotionally charged only because it has not been settled. And the longer the delay continues, the more authority fear gains in shaping perception, convincing the individual that action is dangerous and inaction is safer, even though inaction is what is allowing fear to expand. And this creates a paradox where the mind starts protecting itself from imagined consequences while silently suffering from real internal stagnation. And in this state, confidence diminishes not because of failure, but because of absence of movement. Since confidence is built through experience, and experience can only be gained through decision followed by action. And when that chain is broken, the mind loses reference points for certainty, and uncertainty becomes the default mode of thinking, reinforcing hesitation further and creating a cycle where fear feeds on delay and delay feeds on fear, until even simple decisions require excessive mental effort. And this pattern often goes unnoticed because it develops gradually, disguised as caution, careful thinking, or waiting for the right moment, when in reality it is the slow replacement of clarity with mental noise that grows louder each time a decision is postponed, and the space between thought and action keeps expanding into something heavier, something harder to cross, something that quietly reshapes how possibilities are seen, how risks are measured, and how even potential success begins to feel distant, uncertain, almost unreachable, without realizing how it all began with the simple refusal to choose one direction and move forward instead of remaining suspended between outcomes that exist only in thought and not in reality, yet still continue to expand within the mind as if they already are shaping what comes next. External voices often enter the human mind in a way that feels harmless at first, like advice, concern, experience sharing, or even casual opinions. But over time, these voices can begin to reshape internal thinking if they are repeated, emotionally charged, or accepted without conscious filtering. And what makes this process powerful is that the mind does not naturally separate the source of a thought once it is absorbed, meaning that whether an idea comes from a confident individual or a fearful one, it can still be stored and repeated internally as if it belongs to the self. And this is how external narratives slowly become internal programming, especially when a person is exposed repeatedly to discouraging language, warnings of failure, limitations, or negative expectations about life and ability, because the subconscious mind records patterns rather than intentions. And once these patterns are established, they begin to surface as inner dialogue during decision-making moments, gradually replacing independent thinking with inherited assumptions. And without awareness, a person may start echoing the doubts of others as if they are personal realizations, not recognizing that these thoughts were originally dead from outside experiences. And this transformation is subtle because it does not happen in a single moment, but through repetition across time, where similar messages from different sources begin to align and reinforce each other, creating an illusion of truth simply through frequency. And once this illusion is formed, it gains authority over perception, making external caution feel like internal wisdom, even when it is rooted in fear rather than fact. And this is where fear gains a deeper foothold, because it no longer exists only as a reaction to situations, but becomes a lens through which situations are interpreted, influencing how opportunities are seen, how challenges are evaluated, and how personal capability is measured. And as this continues, the inner voice that once belonged to observation begins to sound like identity, shaping beliefs about what is possible and what is not, often limiting action before it even begins. And the most significant effect of this process is that the individual may feel that they are making independent judgments, while in reality responding to conditioned inputs that were absorbed over time from surroundings, conversations, media, and repeated societal expectations, all of which gradually merge into a single internal narrative that feels self-generated but is actually constructed from repeated exposure. And as long as this process remains unconscious, external voices continue to influence internal decisions, reinforcing patterns of hesitation, doubt, and perceived limitation, without the individual realizing that much of what feels like personal thinking is actually borrowed interpretation shaped by the environment and continuously reinforced through repetition until it becomes indistinguishable from original thought itself. Fear has a tendency to grow strongest when the mind is separated from external reality and left alone with its own unchallenged thoughts, because isolation removes the natural corrective feedback that comes from interaction, experience, and action. And in that absence, the mind begins to turn inward excessively, recycling the same ideas again and again until they lose balance and become distorted versions of reality. In such a state, overthinking becomes the primary activity of consciousness, where thoughts are no longer guided by purpose but by repetition, and each repeated thought gains strength not because it is true, but because it is familiar, and familiarity is often mistaken for validity by the subconscious mind. When a person is isolated for long periods, whether physically or mentally, the absence of contrasting opinions and real-world interaction allows fear-based ideas to expand unchecked, because there is no external force to challenge or interrupt the internal narrative that is being constructed. Overthinking then acts like fuel, continuously feeding these fear patterns with imagined scenarios, projected outcomes, and hypothetical failures that feel increasingly real the more they are mentally rehearsed, even though they have no physical existence in the present moment. Without action, the mind loses reference to truth, because action is the only element that verifies or disproves thought. And in its absence, imagination begins to replace experience as the dominant source of perception. This replacement creates a loop where fear is generated internally, reinforced mentally, and accepted emotionally without any external validation, making it feel increasingly justified and accurate. In such mental conditions, silence becomes misleading because instead of bringing clarity, it amplifies internal noise, allowing minor doubts to grow into dominant beliefs that influence perception of self and surroundings. The longer this cycle continues without interruption through real-world engagement or decisive movement, the more the mind begins to accept its own fears as logical conclusions rather than temporary mental constructions. This is why isolation combined with overthinking is one of the most powerful conditions for fear to expand silently, because it removes correction, multiplies imagination, and strengthens repetition. Without external grounding, the mind continues building internal narratives that feel increasingly certain, even when they are based on incomplete perception. And this certainty grows through repeated mental rehearsal that replaces real validation, causing hesitation to feel like caution and fear to feel like insight, while the individual remains unaware that the entire structure is self-generated through lack of movement and excessive internal focus that continues to spiral deeper into an ever-expanding loop of thought that blurs distinction between imagined possibility and lived reality itself, shaping perception without pause or interruption, as awareness slowly narrows into repetitive internal motion without final resolution forming. Courage is not something that appears before action. It is something that is created through action itself, because fear weakens the moment a person moves forward, even if the movement is small or uncertain, and this is due to the way the mind processes experience versus imagination. When a person only thinks about doing something, fear grows because imagination has no resistance. It can expand endlessly without consequence, but when action is taken, even the smallest step brings contact with reality, and reality immediately begins to correct exaggerated fears. This correction happens because the subconscious mind starts receiving new data based on actual experience instead of projected scenarios. And that new data begins to overwrite the old fear-based patterns that were formed through repetition and overthinking. Each immediate action creates a disruption in the fear loop, forcing the mind to shift from prediction to participation. And in that shift, energy that was once used for worry is redirected toward engagement. Over time, repeated action builds internal evidence of capability, and this evidence slowly replaces doubt with familiarity, which is the foundation of confidence. Fear survives in delay, in hesitation, and in avoidance, because those states allow imagination to remain unchecked. But action introduces structure, direction, and measurable feedback, which reduces uncertainty. Even imperfect action has greater power than perfect intention, because imperfection still produces experience. And experience is what rewires perception. When a person consistently acts despite fear, the mind begins to associate movement with safety rather than danger, and this reconditioning reduces the intensity of fear responses over time. The interesting transformation is that fear does not disappear instantly, but it loses authority, becoming background noise rather than a controlling force, while action becomes the primary driver of thought. In this process, courage is no longer a trait that is searched for internally, but a habit that is built externally through repetition of doing what feels uncertain until it becomes normal. And each repetition strengthens mental resilience in a way that thought alone cannot achieve, because thought remains static, while action produces continuous evidence that reshapes identity and perception of capability, as new patterns begin forming through lived experience rather than imagined limitation. And this shift continues gradually as the cycle of doing replaces the cycle of delaying, and hesitation fades into movement that keeps expanding beyond previous mental boundaries, where each step further reduces the emotional charge attached to fear and strengthens the instinct to act without overanalysis, gradually reshaping the entire mental framework into one that responds with movement rather than hesitation, even when uncertainty still exists in the background, continuing the transition from fear-driven thinking into action-driven awareness. In conclusion, fear is not a force that arrives to destroy you in a single moment. In T, it is a silent process that grows through suggestion, repetition, indecision, external influence, isolation, and overthinking, until it becomes a mental habit that feels natural. It does not need permission to enter the mind. It only needs attention, repetition, and delay to take shape. But just as it is formed silently, it can also be dissolved quietly through awareness, clarity, and most importantly, action. The moment you begin to move, even slightly, you interrupt the cycle that keeps fear alive. You replace imagined outcomes with real experience, and experience is always stronger than assumption. You begin to realize that much of what felt like limitation was never reality, but repetition of thoughts that were never challenged. As you choose direction instead of hesitation and action instead of overthinking, your mind slowly reconditions itself to respond with strength rather than doubt. Fear loses its authority not by fighting it endlessly, but by refusing to pause for it, refusing to let it dictate decisions that belong to your future. Good luck to you as you move forward with this understanding. May you use it not just as knowledge, but as action in your daily life, because everything changes the moment you decide to move despite uncertainty. Thank you.